of the book by Bruce Riedel, What We Won, America's Secret War in Afghanistan. I just recently was able to start reading the book. I picked it up and it was hard to put down. It's one of those books, it's like everything else that Bruce has written. It's engaging, it's interesting, and he's willing to be provocative. And I think you'll see that when he speaks to us today. This is actually the latest of a series of books that he's done on this region, and many of you here I know have sort of seen the three major ones, and that's The Search for Al-Qaeda, Its Leadership and Future. The second is Deadly Embrace, Pakistan, America, and the Future of the Global Jihad. And the third one is Avoiding Armageddon in America, India, and Pakistan to the Brink and Back. Regarding the book today, I can think of few people who are in a position to discuss and analyze the issues as well as Bruce Riedel. And the book is, as I understand in what I've read so far, is an analysis of the role of intelligence in the defeat of the Soviet military in Afghanistan. And as he argues, that defeat had consequences. And some of those consequences provide lessons that might be useful today as the U.S. itself is withdrawing from that region. Bruce has been at the center of policy making and analysis on South Asia in the U.S. government for the last 4 decades. I've known him for quite a long time, and we worked together on some projects. Bruce was the senior advisor in the National Security Council for the Near East and South Asia for the last 4 presidents. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Near East and South Asia, and he was also a principal advisor on the Near East and South Asia at the NATO organization. He's presently a senior fellow at Brookings and director of its intelligence project. But for my purposes and purposes here, he's also an adjunct member of the SAIS faculty. And he is a very popular member of the faculty. His classes are typically oversubscribed. We love that here. And we look forward to his continuing to teach here at SAIS and to welcome him as one of us here at SAIS. So, Bruce. Oh, by the way, if you want to buy a copy of this book, there's a flyer here that tells you how you can get it. You can walk actually down the street if you want to Brookings and get a copy, but Bruce might explain the details of how you can get it much cheaper than paying the full price you see here on the cover. Anyway, Bruce.
Thank you, Walter, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at SAIS. I see a few of my former students in the audience. All of them were guinea pigs for each of these books. I tried out my theories on them, and if they flew, I knew I was at least on the right direction. And if I went down in flames in the Rome building, I knew I needed to rethink what I was trying to say. On the 15th of February, 1989, the chief of station of the CIA station in Islamabad, Milt Bearden, sent a cable back to headquarters in Langley. In very typical Milt Bearden way, he sent it NIAC immediate to every station and base around the world, as well as to Langley, meaning that people were woken up in the middle of the night on literally all continents and countries. The cable was entitled Subject, War in Afghanistan, paragraph 1, in very large letters, said, "We won." Paragraph 2 said, "End of cable, no file." It was a very dramatic way of reporting the results of America's covert war in Afghanistan. Milt also did something else that night. The American embassy in Islamabad then had line of sight to the Russian embassy in Islamabad. And for the 2 years he'd been in Islamabad, Milt had purposefully left on the light in his office every night to give the impression that the CIA was working round the clock to defeat the Soviets. That night, he turned the light out. The KGB resident came to see him a few days later and said, "We got the message." The war in Afghanistan that ended in 1989, other wars continued after 1989, just like the war in Afghanistan is not going to end in 2017. It didn't end in 1989. But the war against the Soviet 40th Red Army and its outcome was, I would argue, a global game changer. The defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan would prove to be the final and decisive battle of the Cold War. Within months after the defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan and the humiliation of a Soviet army being thrown out of a third world state by an illiterate army of peasants, was immense. Within a few months, the Berlin Wall crumbled, the Warsaw Pact imploded, and within a couple of years, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics went out of business. Now, there were many, many reasons for that. The very structure of the communist system and of the Soviet Union was probably doomed to fail sooner or later. But from 1942 to 1989, the Soviet Union had done one thing. It had never lost a battle. The Soviet Red Army was victorious. The myth of the invincibility of the Soviet Red Army was shattered in Afghanistan, and the repercussions are still with us today. The threat of nuclear war that hung over the world from the late 1940s until 1990 went away. We still live in a dangerous world, but it's not like 1962. It's not like 1973. Vladimir Putin has said this was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Not all of us would see it as a catastrophe, but I think Vladimir Putin has put it in perspective. We have recently marked the fall of the Berlin Wall. Very few people have given Afghanistan any credit for that, which I think is very sad in a way. Over 1 million Afghans died between 1979 and 1989 to defeat the Soviet Red Army. If East Germans, Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks are free today, those 1 million Afghans helped to make that happen. They don't seem to get much credit for it. It was an incredibly cheap victory, too, for the United States of America. Not a single American died on the battlefield. 2 American ambassadors died in incidents related to the war in Afghanistan, but they didn't die on the battlefield per se, and they weren't fighting as soldiers of the United States. No CIA officer was killed or wounded. In fact, none ever came near danger. We never let them come near danger. Trying to assess the costs of a covert operation as an outsider are, of course, pretty difficult to do. The Congressional Research Service doesn't publish a list of the expenses of covert operations. You can't go to their website and find out how much money are we spending on covert operations. But piecing together the bits and pieces, I come to the conclusion the total cost of the war for the CIA over 10 years was no more than $4 billion and probably closer than $3 billion. As I said, no boots on the ground, no body bags. At its peak, the CIA's Afghan operation employed less than 50 officers. That includes the analysts who were working on it, the station in Islamabad, and an officer or two at the station in Riyadh whose job was really simple, just to pick up the check and make sure that it was cashed. With the possible exception of the Louisiana Purchase, I would make the argument no federal government project has ever had so much bang for so little buck. But 25 years after the end of the Cold War, we can also see that it marked another event, the beginning of the modern global jihad. The ideology, the narrative of the modern global jihad can be found in Afghanistan. In fact, the definitive book about the modern global jihad, The Defense of Muslim Lands, written by Abdullah Azzam, is the equivalent of Common Sense for the American Revolution for the modern global jihad. In that book, he lays out the case that Islam is under siege and that the only viable alternative is jihad. The connections that put together people like the Haqqanis with the bin Ladens, with the Zawahiris, with the Zarqawis, can all be traced back to the 1980s. That is not a statement that the CIA created Al-Qaeda. That's bad history. That's just reading backwards and trying to make connections that don't exist. But it is true that the origins of the modern global jihad can be found in Afghanistan and the war against the mujahideen. It was a searing experience for many of those involved, most notably Osama bin Laden. And to a very large degree, what Osama bin Laden would end up spending the rest of his life doing was to try to recreate the war against the Soviets against the Americans. For such a seminal event, it's surprising how little literature you find on this war. For most Americans, there's only one book about the war in Afghanistan, Charlie Wilson's War. Now, Charlie Wilson's War is a great book. It's an even better movie, although the movie's filled with inaccuracies, but it's a great movie. But it wasn't Charlie Wilson's War. An obscure Texas congressman did not make the decisions that led to the defeat of the Soviet 40th Red Army. He was a colorful character, and I try to lay out a few colorful vignettes about him in the book, but it wasn't his war. We have accounts from the Soviet side written by mostly non-Russians. We have a brilliant account of the war, actually in 2 volumes from the Pakistani side. We have almost nothing from the Afghan side. The mujahideen were largely illiterate, so you wouldn't expect to have a lot of books written by them, and very few of their commanders had time to write their memoirs. The Saudi story has been put out there, but not in a coherent way anywhere. And as I said, the American side has not been explored at all. What I tried to do in What We Won is, for the first time, look at this war from all the sides involved to give you a holistic picture of what was going on, how each of the parties was motivated in what they were doing, and how the outcome came from that. So what I'd like to do for the next 15 minutes or so is talk about each of the parties a little bit, then draw a conclusion or two, and then open it up to questions, and we can talk not only about the 1980s, which I much prefer doing, but if you really insist, we can also talk about 2014. The party that started the war is the Afghan Communists. The Afghan Communist Party was an unbelievably violent and factionalized organization. The KGB must have torn their hair out every time they had to deal with the Afghan communists, because the Afghan communists could not understand the simple argument that unity is strength. To them, unity meant compromising your principles. What exactly those principles were was hard to divine even then, and even less so today. Factionalism was not really about principles. It was much more about individuals. It was much more about ethnicity. It was much more about urban versus rural. One Afghan communist leader has, of course, survived, and I profile him, Abdul Rashid Dostum, the ultimate survivor, a man who went from being the KGB's star pupil to being vice president of Afghanistan today. Somehow, miraculously, in 1992, he suddenly had a conversion from Marxism to Islam and capitalism. I don't think he ever had a conversion to democracy, but somehow he was able to make that. One feature about the Afghan communists that is often lost in looking backwards is that there was one thing that united them. They were all strong believers in the notion of Pashtunistan. That is to say, that Afghanistan's borders have been drawn incorrectly, illegally, by Imperial Britain, and that Afghanistan should be expanded to include all of the Pashtun areas of Pakistan. Believers in Pashtunistan also usually decide that if we're going to take all of Pashtun Pakistan, we might as well take Baluchi Pakistan as well, and therefore we'll be able to have access to the sea. All of the Afghan communists were entranced with the idea of Pashtunistan. This had important implications because others on the outside could see that if the communists succeeded in Afghanistan, they still had a drive to go further, a drive for the infamous warm water port on the Indian Ocean. There's no evidence that the Soviets had much interest in this, but they never disagreed with the notion of Pashtunistan. The Soviets were a conflicted aggressor in Afghanistan. Looking back now at the Soviet archives, it is clear that for the longest amount of time after the communist coup in Afghanistan, the Great Sour Revolution as it was called, Moscow did not want to intervene. Moscow, all the way up to Brezhnev and everyone, believed that to intervene in Afghanistan would be to be yourself involved in a hopeless quagmire that would go on and on for years and years. But in the end, they decided they had to intervene, that there was no alternative, that they could not let a Soviet client state on Soviet Union's border, especially the Soviet Central Asian border next to Iran, crumble without seeing it having devastating effects for the Soviet Union itself. But because they were conflicted about whether to go in or not, they tried to do it on the cheap. They tried to take over Afghanistan with as few resources as possible. Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on Christmas 1979 with roughly 80,000 troops. At their peak, they had roughly 110,000 troops. For most of the 10 years, they had roughly 100,000 troops. In 1956, when they took over Hungary, they went in with 250,000 troops. In 1968, when they went into Czechoslovakia, they went in with 500,000 troops. Now, the mountains of Bohemia and Moravia are significant by European standards, but they pale next to the Hindu Kush. In other words, the Soviets were trying to take over a country with very, very few resources when they had many, many more resources that they could have used. Throughout the war, one of the biggest questions for CIA analysts was, why aren't the Soviets trying harder? Why don't they put the troops in? Well, the answer was leadership. The Soviet Union had sclerotic leadership. Brezhnev and his two successors were so sick, they really didn't know what was going on. And in a communist party dictatorship, if the head is rotten, the system doesn't work very well. It wasn't really until Gorbachev came into office that Soviet leadership was able to focus on Afghanistan, and by that point, arguably, it was too late. The Soviets did, and this is another episode that's largely forgotten, try very hard to intimidate Pakistan. We'll come to Pakistan in a minute. But it's often lost in looking back at this area that the Soviet Union, with the aid of the Afghan communists, was engaged in a major effort to intimidate Islamabad. They essentially created a terrorist organization using Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's two sons to try to carry it out. They attempted to assassinate Zia ul-Haq at least once, and probably more than that. They hijacked a Pakistani international airliner and flew it to Damascus, Syria, where the Soviets and the Syrians, Hafez al-Assad's intelligence service, assisted them. The problem was that the two Bhutto brothers were completely incompetent and were complete failures at the business of really running a terrorist organization. But there was a pretty odd alliance at its height. Not only was the KGB assisting the Zulfikar group, as it was called, but so was the Afghan communists, so were Soviet client states like Syria, and so was the Indian intelligence service, which was actually training Zulfikar terrorists inside India. I'm not going to say a whole lot about the mujahideen. They were both the winner and the losers of the war. They're the obvious winners. The battlefield was in their hands when the war ended. And after 3 years further struggle against the Afghan communists, they inherited all of Afghanistan in 1992 and promptly engaged in a vicious civil war that in many ways is still going on today. So they were winners, but at the same time losers. 1 million Afghan dead, at least that many severely injured, 6 to 8 million Afghan refugees, an equal number of displaced people on the inside. I said earlier the Soviet Union tried to win the war on the cheap. Part of trying to win the war on the cheap was to engage in mass terror against the Afghan people. The Soviet Union littered Afghanistan with mines, particularly small anti-personnel mines designed to wound children. The Soviet analysis was that a wounded Afghan children required his family to take care of him and therefore would not be on the battlefield. There was no general headquarters of the Mujahideen per se. There was no coordinated effort. There were roughly a half dozen different major political parties on the Afghan side, but they were more instruments of exiles in Pakistan than there were people on the ground. To the extent that there was a general headquarters, to the extent there was coordination, it was all provided by the ISI. I'll get there in a minute. The Mujahideen did produce one truly great commander, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who has to be ranked up there with Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, and Mao Zedong as among the most brilliant guerrilla commanders of the 20th century. But he was also a very controversial figure during the war. He agreed to a ceasefire with the Soviet Union at one time, and he facilitated the Soviets' withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 on the argument, why should we discourage them from leaving? If they're going to go, we should help them get out as quickly as possible. I said earlier it was not Charlie Wilson's war. It was Zia-ul-Haq's war. Pakistan was the driving force in this war, and General Zia-ul-Haq was the key decision maker. If you look back at the decisions that led to the defeat of the Soviet Union, they all have Zia's fingerprints on it, more than anyone else, more than any American. Zia was a true believer. He believed in the jihad. Had he lived, he probably would have continued the jihad against India in the 1990s. He was making preparations for that for sure. He was not a fan of American Western democracy. He did not believe in our way of life. Whatever he told Joanne Herring, the starlet of Charlie Wilson's war, about wanting to fight communism for Christianity, that's not what he was in it for. He got his start in the Pakistani military, ironically in Jordan, in Black September in 1970, where he essentially became a member of the Jordanian armed forces fighting for King Hussein. On his watch, the Pakistani intelligence service blossomed. It had roughly 3,000 employees in 1978. By 1988, it had 40,000 employees. And that's not counting the sources, the informants. This is counting simply uniformed members of the ISI. The ISI, at Zia's direction, trained somewhere like 80,000 mujahideen during the course of the war at bases first in Pakistan and then later in Afghanistan as well. By 1987, at the peak of the war, the ISI was sending 65,000 tons of ammunition and other equipment into Afghanistan every year to fight the Soviet Union. It built on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan in Afghanistan a major base called Zahawar, which had a state-of-the-art hospital, a VIP hotel for visiting VIPs. I haven't been able to track down any VIPs who actually stayed there, but I understand there was a VIP hotel there. Radio stations, ISI quarters, surface-to-air missile cantonment. It was, in effect, an ISI base across the border inside Afghanistan. The ISI did more than that. The ISI, at Zia's instruction, took the war into Kabul and ultimately into Soviet Central Asia. Mujahideen forces led by ISI serving officers and members of the Pakistani commando forces went into Soviet Central Asia to carry out acts of sabotage. Not at the beginning of the war, though. At the beginning of the war, Zia was very careful, very, very cautious. He liked to tell the Americans that it needs to boil just right, to steam, not to get out of control. Only as he became more and more confident did he encourage the ISI and the Americans to go further and further. If you think about it for a minute, actually sending ISI officers into Soviet Central Asia was provocative to the extreme. Here was a relatively small third world country, Pakistan, taking on the largest military force in the world in the 1980s. Zia was a master at figuring out how much he could get away with. One footnote here. There's one country that I wish I could have studied more about with regards to the war, but there's simply nothing to study, and that's China. The main source of the armaments that the ISI shipped to the Afghans were Chinese made. At the beginning of the war, both the CIA and the ISI believed that no American arms should be used, that only Soviet arms should be used, so as to maintain plausible deniability that all these arms were just left on the battlefield by defeated Soviet forces. Well, where were you going to get Soviet-made arms in the 1980s? There were two principal possibilities, actually three. One was Israel. The Pakistanis and Saudis said, no, we're not going to go there. Second was Egypt. And a lot of Egyptian arms did end up there, only they were found to be utterly useless. In most cases, they didn't work. And then there was China. China ended up being the major source of arms for the Afghan mujahideen, paid for by CIA and Saudi money. The Saudis were the financier of the jihad. I think everyone knows who studied this at all that the Saudis early on agreed to match every American taxpayer's dollar with an equal amount of Saudi money, so that for the $4 billion the CIA spent in Afghanistan, it actually got $8 billion worth of activity because the Saudis matched everything. But that's only to look at the tip of the Saudi iceberg. That's the official state money that was going to the Mujahideen and the ISI. A much larger amount of money was coming out of the coffers of the Saudi royal family, so-called private money, although how you can distinguish between a Saudi prince's money and the Saudi Ministry of Defense's money is a little hard for most people to find. The state money was coordinated by Saudi Arabia's intelligence director, Prince Turki. The private money was coordinated by the then governor of Riyadh, Prince Salman. For those of you who are Saudi watchers, he is, of course, today the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis also encouraged Saudi volunteers to go. Osama bin Laden went on his own, but many others were encouraged to go. I've already mentioned Abdullah Azzam's book, The Defense of Muslim Lands. The foreword, the introduction to The Defense of Muslim Lands, was written by the head of the Wahhabi faith in Saudi Arabia in the 1980s, a blind preacher by the name of bin Baz, who was an enthusiastic supporter. 20,000 or more foreign fighters ended up going to Afghanistan in the 1980s. Record keeping was not very good on this issue, so 20,000 is a figure I would use as an estimate, a very round number. It could have been 30,000, it could have been even more than that. For the most part, they were militarily insignificant. The Arab fighters were not particularly good. The mujahideen regarded most of them as useless. They didn't engage in suicide bombings in those days, so they couldn't do that either. Lots of them were what were called Gucci guerrillas. That is, they got their picture taken in a training camp on the Pakistani border and flew home immediately. They were able to say, hey, look, I fought in the war, here's my picture. That wasn't true of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was a combat engineer. He fought on the battlefield. More important than that, he was an engineer. He really was his father's son. He helped build that underground camp that I mentioned earlier, working very, very closely with the mujahideen and working even more closely with the ISI. I interviewed several British officers involved in the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and I have a vignette that I didn't use in the book because I was asked not to use it, but I'll use it here. Unlike the Americans, who never went on the battlefield, the British Secret Intelligence Service every year sent teams into Afghanistan, particularly to support Ahmad Shah Massoud. So they would send in maybe a dozen or so officers with the mujahideen to train Ahmad Shah Massoud's people, to provide the latest technology, to show the flag, in essence, for Queen and country. One of those officers going in remembers in 1986 or 1987, as they were getting ready to go in to Afghanistan, they could see that another party was coming out. And it was pretty clear who that party was. It was Osama bin Laden. He was even then rather well known for being one of the tallest people in South Asia. But what's remarkable about this vignette is how hard the ISI worked to make sure that the going in party and the coming out party stayed far apart from each other, that the two different parts of the ISI's war did not overlap at all. So a fleeting glimpse was all he got. Let me conclude by looking at the American role in the war. The United States was completely caught by surprise on Christmas Eve, 1979. Believe me, I was in the CIA's operations center. I had other business to do. When the National Security Agency began to report very high levels of flight activity across the Soviet Union, like 2,000 airplanes taking off all at the same time. The National Security Agency, in one of the boldest and bravest predictions, put out a report on Christmas morning, possible Soviet invasion of Afghanistan imminent. Of course, in fact, the Soviet invasion was well underway. The CIA and the rest of the American intelligence community was caught completely off guard. They had come to the same conclusion as the Soviet Politburo. An invasion of Afghanistan would lead to a quagmire. No smart Soviet will ever do that, therefore they won't do that. Therefore all these indications that they're about to do that are wrong, and they won't do it. Jimmy Carter's diary reveals that he didn't even get any indication this was happening until late on Christmas Day, and did not understand the severity of it until probably the day after. But whatever you think of Jimmy Carter, he reacted very vigorously. Within 2 weeks after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, the basic strategy and coalition that would win the war was put into place by Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And the first CIA arms arrived in Karachi 13 days after the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The strategy that Carter developed of working with the Pakistanis, of working with the Saudis, of bringing the Chinese in, of bringing the British in, was all designed in 2 weeks in late December and January, 79 and 1980. The goal then was a Soviet Vietnam. Nobody, in their wildest imaginations, imagined that the Mujahideen would win. There were arguments within the CIA about the morality of letting Afghans die in a hopeless cause. In the end, it was decided, well, they were going to do it anyway. We might as well help them in their hopeless cause as much as possible. When the Reagan administration came into office, it simply put the policy on autopilot. For the first 4 years of the Reagan administration, the Carter strategy was essentially continued in place. Bill Casey, Reagan's director of Central Intelligence and his campaign chief of staff in the 1980 election, didn't make his first trip to Pakistan until a year later. They didn't see anything that they needed to fix, and Zia didn't want anything more. It was doing just well, don't interfere. It wasn't until 1986 that, of course, you have the famous decision to provide the Stinger. As I say out in the book, that decision was really made largely by Zia. Once Zia said, yes, I want it, the debate inside Washington about the wisdom of doing so came to an end. If Zia wanted it, Reagan wanted it, and Casey wanted it. In that debate, of course, there had been a furious argument over whether or not the Mujahideen could be counted on to be reliable with the Stinger. A debate in which people said if we give these advanced weapons to the Mujahideen, surely they'll end up in the hands of the Russians and the Iranians and other bad guys. That debate probably resonates for some people thinking about today. And they were right. Within 6 months, and probably much faster than that, both the Russians and Iranians had working Stinger missiles that they had either purchased or captured from the Mujahideen. Since we've already put Carter and Reagan together on this issue, I'll just make one other obvious point here. This was a fully bipartisan war. There was enthusiastic support for the war. The one thing Charlie Wilson's war captures absolutely correctly is that there was a lot of enthusiasm on the Hill, enthusiasm in some cases which had to be curbed by the executive offices because the Hill wanted to do more and had some crazy ideas about what it wanted to do. Charlie Wilson in particular had a lot of kind of bizarre ideas about weapon systems that he thought would make a lot of sense. I can't help but tell one Charlie Wilson vignette. Charlie Wilson, as everyone knows, always had a beautiful girl on his arm, never the same one 2 nights in a row. But sometime in the mid-1980s, Charlie Wilson had fallen in love. I think she was a former Miss Texas, and had popped the question, and they were going to get married. Charlie Wilson went to Zia al-Haq and said, I'd like to get married in the Khyber Pass. Would you be prepared to provide a supporting cast? You know, Bengal Lancers, tanks, and everything. Zia said, of course, whatever you want, Charlie. And then Charlie said, and I have a lot of Jewish friends and Israeli friends who'd like to come. And Zia said, this is a little more difficult. As long as they have American passports, though, we won't look too carefully at who they are. Mrs. Texas or Charlie or both decided in the end not to do it, and so the wedding of the century never occurred in the Khyber Pass. Throughout the war, the American intelligence community's focus was on the Soviet Union. The Arab volunteers and other distractions did not feature on the radar screen. The issue was, how are we going to defeat the Soviets or not? What do the Pakistanis need to defeat the Soviets? Osama bin Laden is a name that Bob Gates, who was then Deputy Director of Central Intelligence and effectively the effective acting director after Bill Casey's stroke, says never came up. He never heard that name in any meeting during the war. That obviously was a severe intelligence mistake. There are still a lot of unknowns about this war, issues that we don't really have the bottom line answer to. At the top of my list, of course, is who killed Zia al-Haq. There wasn't an accident. The investigation pretty thoroughly indicated that there was some kind of malfeasance here. The cast of characters who may have been responsible, though, is so long that it will probably never actually come to a conclusion. The KGB's archives, which have not been opened, might have the answer, but so far we don't have it. When I embarked upon this book, one of the things I wanted to do was study a successful covert operation. Why did this thing work? A lot of books have been written about intelligence failures. If you go to the SAIS library, you can find endless numbers of books about Pearl Harbor, the Bay of Pigs, Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. There aren't very many books about how intelligence can be successful. And it seems to me if we want to learn more about how intelligence works, maybe we ought to concentrate a little less on the failures, because I don't think the answer is there, and on successes. Of course, there aren't a whole lot of publicly available successes to look at. So why did we win the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s? I think the principal reason is Russian mistakes. Russia made huge mistakes. Had Russia been more willing to convict the resources, the Russians probably would have done better, or at least lasted longer. Second reason, we had very strong allies. In Zia al-Haq and King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, we had two committed individuals who really wanted this to succeed, in some ways wanted it more than we did. That's different from many other covert operations. But lastly, and probably most important in the end, we won because of the courage of the Afghan people. The Afghan people were going to fight the Soviets anyway. We just gave them the arms to do it more efficiently. They paid an enormous price, and arguably they are still paying the price for this. They get very little credit for it, but they deserve much more than they did. With that, I'm going to sit down and be happy to take questions.
Okay. Well, there's a lot there. And when you ask your question, identify who you are. And given the nature of the topic, ask one question only. And if you have a statement to make, keep it quite short as well, because there's a lot here. But I'll take the prerogative of chairing this to ask the first question. You mentioned, Bruce, that the Pashtuns in the 70s and 80s had a very negative view toward the Duran line and the line that was drawn in opposing it. Do you find a similar opposition among Taliban on either side of the border to the illegitimacy of that border?
I don't see a lot of people these days publishing maps of Pashtunistan. If you go back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s, of course there was no internet, so you wouldn't have found them on the internet, but you would have found maps of Pashtunistan and irredentist Afghanistan very widely available. I don't see those very much anymore, but I would say this. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban government, never accepted the Duran line. They were as close to being a puppet of Pakistan, particularly by 1999-2000, when they really needed Pakistani support, and they would refuse to do it. I think that Pashtunistan is an issue that is very likely to be back on our horizons come January 2017, if we stay on track and leave all American forces leave then, and the Afghan intelligence service now starts trying to look for ways to pay Pakistan in kind for what they believe Pakistan has been doing to them for the last decade.
Steve Cohen? There's a microphone coming.
Yeah, Bruce, I read the book completely and just thought it was marvelous. I have two comments on it, both analytical. I have some other comments, like the Chinese mules, but that's a separate discussion. One is that one of the questions the title raises is the question of limited victory and limited war, total war. Not only who won and who lost, but what they thought the stakes were and what the consequences were. That's a different kind of book than you wrote, but I think that's a suitable, good analytical project, because Americans tend to look for total victory.
Right.
And in Afghanistan, it was a total victory in the sense the Soviet Union fell, but it was not a total victory in the sense that unleashed forces which have created a whole series of limited wars for us. That's the second analytical point. When the Soviet Union fell, it was clear, at least to me, that the new conflicts in the world would be ethnicity and religion, and that we would have to learn to deal with them. And we would miss the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union provided an order to the world, which the new world doesn't have. There was a single leader we could deal with, single leadership we could deal with. Now it was snakes and dragon, the dragon versus the snake. So I think that's another analytical point in a sense. Americans find it difficult to grasp the change of the international order from a major single enemy to now many, many problems and many threats, some of which were allied against former potential enemies like China, against even Russia. Another subject for dissertation, but that's another.
Well, not surprisingly, Steve and I are in violent agreement, as we often are. The title. I don't know what your experience with Brookings Press is, but my experience with Brookings Press is we spend far more time fiddling with the title than we do with anything else. And this one, I thought the title should be "We Won, America's Secret War." Smarter people than I decided that wasn't right, and every possible iteration of why we won, where we won, who we won was used, and my son chose what we won, and it was good enough for him, it's good enough for me. But it gets to your point. For most of the war, for the United States, it was a limited war. This was about Vietnam. This was all about payback for Vietnam. If you interview Milt Bearden, Frank Anderson, Tom Twetton, Chuck Cogan, the other people who were the commanders of the war inside the Directorate of Operations in the 1980s, either the chiefs of station in the region or, more importantly, the people who were managing the war in any division of the DO, it was all about Vietnam. That's what they were doing. And many of them had served in Vietnam. Almost all of them had served during the Vietnam War, and that's what this was all about. Even when the decision was made to provide the Stinger and escalate, very, very few people thought that the Soviets would be defeated. And as you'll remember, when Shevardnadze told the Secretary of State that we're leaving, nobody believed it. Gates recounts in his book, his first autobiography, that he made a bet with everybody in the Deputies Committee that the Soviets wouldn't leave, and he happily paid out later on. It was a total war, though, certainly for the mujahideen and the Afghans, and I would argue it was a total war for the Pakistanis as well. They were prepared to risk everything. The risks that they took have been forgotten, I think, a lot. Zia's nightmare in the early 1980s was that the Soviet Union and Indira Gandhi's India would simply decide, okay, we've had enough of Pakistan. You come in from the north, we'll come in from the west, and we'll carve this state up. Pashtunistan will be free. We'll give the Bhutto brothers Karachi and the Sindh, which is actually what they were asking for, and India will keep the rest. Now, I think that was a true nightmare. You know, a nightmare in the sense there wasn't really any reason to believe that was going to happen. But it's pretty clear from talking to people who were talking to Zia then, and what records we have of Casey, which are unfortunately very few, that it was very much on his mind. And Mrs. Gandhi's assassination largely removes that fear, because Zia sized up Rajiv and said, he's not the Iron Lady. I don't have to worry about this kid.
Way at the back.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Twab Malikzad. I'm from Voice of America. I have one question with two parts. The first part is, you said that CIA and other intelligence agency was quite surprised by invasion of Afghanistan. How are they surprised? Because a year and a half before that, we had the Saur Revolution, which was basically the takeover of the Communist Party. And then Amin, the president during that time, multiple times invited Soviet Union to Afghanistan. How were they surprised by invasion? And my second question is more towards the fact that you say that the reason that CIA or we won the war in Afghanistan is because Soviet Union did not commit enough resources. Do you think that we are losing the war right now in Afghanistan because we are not committing enough resources? And the fact Taliban have the same kind of mentality that mujahideen did, they are committed to fight. Are we going to see another victory by Taliban and history just repeats itself? Thanks.
Do you have a third, more contentious question?
Well, the first question is subject to fact. Thanks to the CIA's own program of declassification of intelligence, estimative material, and the superb work of the National Security Archives at GW, we have an awful lot of the actual CIA estimates written in 1979 about what the Soviet Union were going to do. I mean, no question in the Cold War was more important than anticipating Soviet military activity. This was what 90% of the CIA's budget was about. And if you go back and read the declassified intelligence estimates prepared in the fall of 1979, the daily National Intelligence Dailies, and the subsequent two post-mortems done by the CIA, one done in 1980 at the request of Brzezinski, and another one done by the Center for the Study of Intelligence at CIA after the war was all over, there's no question of surprise. The CIA and the entire intelligence community, there were no dissenters, said the Soviet Union will not commit major ground forces to a war in Afghanistan. That would be a foolish mistake, and the Soviet leadership won't do it. And they were right up until about September of 1979. When the interfactional fighting inside the Communist Party got so out of control that they decided we have to go in. And the author of that decision was the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. This was his great idea. He convinced a almost brain-dead Brezhnev to go forward with it. And he convinced the rest of the Soviet leadership, and they went forward. To give you an idea of the surprise factor, President Carter was generous enough, I went and interviewed President Carter. He was generous enough to give me a copy of his private diary, or at least all the mentions of his private diary of Afghanistan and Pakistan during his 4 years in office. And there's, in the summer and fall of 1979, there are repeated briefings that he got from the CIA on what's going on in Afghanistan, but there's no hint in that diary that he was being told an invasion is coming. In fact, to the contrary, it makes very clear that he was being told Yes, the situation is deteriorating for the Afghan communists, but the Soviet Union, we believe, will not intervene in Afghanistan. So I think the record there is very clear. Why did the United States conclude that? Well, one thing was we didn't know that the Politburo switched. We didn't have an agent in the Politburo, so we didn't know. And secondly, we mirror imaged. We decided that the Soviet leadership would act like the American leadership, which is one of the greatest mistakes that any intelligence service can do. It's one of the most frequent intelligence mistakes that people do. You assume that the guy, your enemy, is thinking the same way you are thinking, and it turns out their calculations are completely different than yours. Your second question. Let's start with fact. Resources. 80,000 man invasion force, roughly 100,000 expeditionary force for most of a decade. The United States and its NATO allies for the first 5 years of the war in Afghanistan had around 10 to 15,000 troops on the ground. We peaked at 140,000 troops briefly 2 years ago. But if you compare the resources the Soviet Union put in to the resources that America and NATO put in, the Soviet Union put in more resources earlier and for a longer and sustained period of time. In that sense, we have under-resourced the war even more than they have. But there's a lot of apples and oranges here as well. The mujahideen could call on the loyalty of almost all of Afghanistan's ethnic groups. Ahmad Shah Massoud was famously, of course, a Tajik. The Hazaris, the Shias were part, the Pashtuns were part. The only question mark about loyalty to the Mujahideen cause can be raised about the Uzbek minority, and even there you had a lot of Uzbek Mujahideen. We don't face the same problem in Afghanistan, or at least we haven't faced it up until now. We have faced a largely Pashtun rebellion. So in that sense, you can make the case we don't need as many resources. Of course, the big similarity, the huge similarity between the two wars is the role played by Pakistan. Pakistan was the safe haven and sanctuary, trainer, and the rest for the Mujahideen, and today it is the same for the Afghan Taliban. The Quetta Shura doesn't meet in Quetta by accident. It meets there because that's where the ISI wants it to meet. In that sense, we and the Soviets have both faced a common problem in trying to figure out how to get Pakistan to not be the supporter of the insurgency. And I think it's safe to say in 2014, we are no closer to an answer than the Soviets were in the 1980s. The other interesting resource question is the whole question of building an Afghan security force. Right from the beginning of their war, the Soviets concentrated on rebuilding an Afghan communist army. They put a lot of resources into it. It never went very well, but it surprisingly did better than many people thought. I mentioned one intelligence failure. The second intelligence failure in the war was in 1989. The CIA, the ISI, the British Intelligence Service, the Saudis all confidently predicted that when they crossed the river and went into the Soviet Union, the communist government would collapse in a matter of weeks or months. It ended up surviving 3 years. The residual force the Afghan communists put together was capable of holding on to major cities. It was incapable of carrying out operations in the field, but it could hold on to major cities. It had at its peak an air force of 300 fixed-wing, 300 rotary wing and 100 fixed-wing aircraft. The Afghan Air Force that we have created after 13 years is 1/10 the size of that. The Soviets obviously understood that counterinsurgency requires air power. For some reasons that are a mystery to me, the United States of America and the NATO alliance have never figured that out about the future of Afghanistan. We're belatedly now trying to put it together, but it's a long time late in the game.
Thank you. Good question in the middle there. Right, yeah.
Judith Kipper, thanks, Bruce. Terrific presentation. I'd like to ask you a policy question. If we won in Afghanistan because the Soviets made a lot of mistakes, Pakistan was gung-ho and the mujahideen were gung-ho, and we were able to help them, what can we extrapolate from that experience to fighting the bad guys, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Nusra, et cetera, because Turkey could be the Pakistan, but it's not willing to be. There's absolutely nobody in the Arab world that can be the mujahideen. And while air power can do a little bit, it's very, very, very limited. There's not a single army in the Arab world that's worth 5 cents. So what, from the experience in Afghanistan, where we were so helpful, but we had real partners, what can we extrapolate from that to the situation that we are facing now? Maybe we should do nothing. It's a homegrown problem.
It's another very good question, Judith. You know, one of the things that they hammer into you if you study history at Harvard is that each historical episode is its own unique thing, and don't try to and graduate students who keep making comparisons between this and that consistently get C's in their grades. I ignored all of that stuff. Like you, I want to try to make comparisons. Well, first comparison. ISIS is not the Soviet Union. Okay. We're not dealing with a global power. Thank God. Thank God. This is a much different. When politicians run around this town these days saying it's never been as bad as it is today, they're full of it, you know. 1979, 1980 was a much more dangerous era than 2014. That said, if there is one key lesson of the Afghan war is you need a partner. And who is that partner? Turkey would be an excellent partner. They know the territory, they have a very good intelligence service, they have a very good army, and the geography is perfect, but they don't want to do it. I was in Turkey a few months ago, and the message I got from the Turks, and I'm going to put it in my words, not theirs, was, been there, done that, ruled the Arab world for 500 years, bad mistake, got out of it, have no interest in going home, thank God for the Kaiser. Somebody actually said that to me. Kaiser taught us to get out of there, we're not going to make that mistake again. So who's the alternative? Jordan, conceivably, but Jordan's a weak country. And we would be putting a huge burden on a country that might not, the burden might crush, instead of us winning, we could end up seeing ISIS spread into the Hashemite kingdom, which would be a true disaster. The Iranians, and I would argue that's in essence what's going on in Iraq today. We have a partnership with the Iranians. We don't like to talk about it. They don't like to talk about it. But it's the practical reality on the ground. But that's a highly problematic entente, and many, many things could undo it. And I don't think that's the answer. The answer, we are told, is Saudi Arabia. We are told that we will train troops in Saudi Arabia. So I keep trying to get this in my mind. We want to train a moderate force of inclusive, tolerant, progressive warriors in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A little hard problem getting those two together. Huge problem. I think that is the hole in the president's strategy. He doesn't have a partner, and he doesn't have a partner on the ground in Syria. One other point I would make, and I alluded to it in the talk, if you are worried that your weapons are going to end up in the wrong hands, you are right. They will end up in the wrong hands. Count on that from day one. Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey decided it was worth the price. So if we want this to work in Syria, that's part of the price. The weapons will end up in the wrong hands. We just have to learn to live with that from day one.
Thank you. Bruce, it was very enlightening, substantive, and believe me, intriguingly interesting to listen to you today. An observation, you mentioned most of the Americans did not believe the Soviets' troops would withdraw. I think the entire world did not believe it. All the political pundits believe they don't withdraw. This is their pattern. They only had withdrawn after the Second World War, negotiated withdrawal from Azerbaijan and Austria. After that, they had a pattern. And people believe they will continue that pattern, thanks to USA, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. My question to you is, you have very elaborately explained how the war was won. But could you also tell us why the peace has been lost? And second part was that Ahmad Shah Massoud, he was a famous commander and a great fighter. What was the motive and who was behind and why he was killed? Thank you.
Let me take the second question first. Ahmad Shah Massoud's own motive is very interesting. Ahmad Shah Massoud grew up in the 1960s, and on 5th of June 1967, he was listening to the BBC when the Six-Day War began, and he was absolutely fascinated. He became a military junkie in the course of 6 days. Now, of course, the side he was supporting lost disastrously, but his interest in military affairs, according to people who knew him and who I talked to, starts with that interesting vignette. He was killed by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda developed an elaborate plot in 2001. Ahmad Shah Massoud was a very reclusive individual. He didn't like to deal with the media. He didn't like to travel. But he had traveled in 2000, I believe, to Europe, where he made an appeal at the European Union for help against the Taliban. He was also meeting secretly with the CIA in, I think, in Paris then. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden in particular, it was an Osama bin Laden planned operation, then devised a very interesting operation. They created a fictional journalist group based in Belgium, which requested a follow-up interview with Ahmad Shah Massoud to be held in Afghanistan. And they recruited two Muslims with Belgian citizenship to carry out a suicide operation. And famously, they had the bomb in the camera. And because it was a follow-up to an earlier trip, Ahmad Shah Massoud broke his own rules and agreed to an interview. And the first question in the interview was, Mr. Massoud, what do you think of the Sheikh, the hero of Islam, Osama bin Laden? And probably at that moment, Ahmad Shah Massoud realized he'd made a mistake and the bomb exploded and he was killed instantly. Sorry, remind me what your first question was again.
You very well explained how the war was won.
Right.
But why the peace has been lost?
Well, that's a very, very complicated question, of course, but I will give you part of the answer. Part of the answer, I believe, is that we continued to use an intelligence organization to achieve our outcome in Afghanistan long after that wasn't the right organization. What do I mean by that? When the war against the Russians ended, arguably the CIA operation should have ended as well. Did we really care whether Kabul was run by a bunch of Afghan communists or a bunch of Afghan mujahideen? That wasn't the big picture issue. But the Bush administration decided that the CIA would continue to be the lead agency in Afghanistan and that its relationship with the mujahideen would be the lead agency. The Bush administration did try to set up a parallel approach using Peter Tomseth from the State Department and a diplomatic approach, but if you've read his book, which is a substantial investment of your time, since it's, I think, 1,000 pages long. It's a very good book, but it's a long, long book. He makes pretty clear that he felt that his mission was undermined. I don't think it was undermined so much as we were trying to use a hammer when we needed to switch to a screwdriver or something else. But we continued to use the hammer, and as a consequence, it didn't work. And within a year, Washington lost interest, for good reason. Cold War ended. There were more important questions: the future of Germany, the future of the Ukraine, the future of Iraq, the future of Kuwait, the Intifada. All these other issues piled up on the Bush administration's inbox, and Afghanistan became that issue that, oh yes, we really should have a meeting on that. Talk to the schedulers. We'll come back to that. Now, other parts of the U.S. government continued to work on it, but it got no attention at the senior level of the Bush administration. I was Richard Haas's deputy from July 1991 until Richard left, and I don't remember ever having a senior meeting on Afghanistan in that whole period. Not a single meeting. The meetings we did have were all about Operation MIA, Missiles Missing in Action. When we belatedly came to the conclusion that we had provided more Stingers than there were Russians to shoot down, and that there were something like 1,000 Stingers still in the hands of the Mujahideen. And then we did the extraordinary thing of paying the ISI to get back the missiles that we had already given them. So the gravy train for the ISI went on for some considerable period after then.
Thank you, Ruhollah Osmani. I'm with SAIS, and I had the pleasure of being Professor Riedel's student at SAIS. My part of question will be more on 2014 and beyond 2014 in my concern. We discussed the consequences of Cold War in Afghanistan and some of the challenges that we see the result now. For example, the global jihad and civil war and all this issue in Afghanistan and Pakistan. When President George Bush started the war against Al-Qaeda, and he announced that U.S. is not in the business of nation building in Afghanistan, we are fighting terrorists. At the same time, when President Obama took office, he said Afghanistan is already a nation. We are not building nation there. We are fighting terrorism and Al-Qaeda there. But we can see that the nation building is a big issue there in Afghanistan, sustaining the peace and stability and keeping the country together. What would you advise if you advise the current administration with regards to the lessons learned we had from the post-Soviet war in Afghanistan? At the same time, just a small second part is the partners for the global jihad war and Al-Qaeda, now especially when the US is drawing down from Afghanistan. It seems the notion of partnership is now toward more India, to US to get India to support this process. How you think that will be practical to convince Pakistan not to support the Taliban?
Well, just on the second part, I believe we are already seeing the regeneration of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. Bin Laden's announcement of a new Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which is much more fluid in Arabic than the kind of awkward Indian subcontinent phraseology, as an evidence of that regeneration. I'm not surprised by it. The reason Al-Qaeda in Pakistan has been on the defensive the last several years is well known, and that pressure has been coming off. Your broader question I'm a little bit pregnant on. I did provide a lot of advice early on in the administration on this. Nation building is a dirty word here, but that is what we're engaged in doing. I'm not wildly optimistic that it's going to work. I think that with a lot of mistakes, a lot of negligence for 7 years, we have had some success in building an Afghan security force in the last 6 years. Far from perfect. I've already mentioned air power. That seems to have been, somebody forgot that tab in the binder. There are other missing ingredients. There's no medical service. I mean, we seem to assume that the Afghan army won't suffer any casualties, therefore they don't need a medical service. I don't know whose idea that is. All those deficiencies aside, because it is a different war than the 1980s, as I mentioned already, I don't think it's the same war all over again, because I think most Afghans do not want to live under the Afghan Taliban again. Been there, done that, learned lesson, not going back there. I think there is some possibility that with continued foreign support for an indefinite period of time, the Afghan state that we have put together, and which now has new leadership, will survive. That Kabul will not fall to the Afghan Taliban in 2017. I would be much more comfortable in that judgment if the president took his foreign policy off of the egg timer and said that I'm not going to decide how many troops to keep in Afghanistan in December 2016, in November 2014. I think I might wait until we get there, make that decision then. I think that's a very, very unfortunate decision, bordering on reckless, because it sends a signal to the enemy and to the frenemy, if you want to call them that, that all you got to do is wait. You know, it'll fall like a ripe fruit into your hands in 2017. Again, Iraq, Afghanistan, not the same story, but a pretty convincing argument can be made that we are repeating exactly a mistake we made in Iraq. I wouldn't take that too far, but I think there's reason to suggest that the egg timer we put ourselves on back before the fall of Mosul should now definitely be taken off. That doesn't mean keeping 20,000 troops. It doesn't mean keeping 10,000 troops. It means making that decision in 2016 and not in 2014, and leaving your options open. I remain hopeful that that decision will be subject to re-investigation and perhaps changed. But it hasn't been so far.
Can I push you on what was part of his second question, and that is India as a place that we should be pointing to. And I think you bring that up because India in the last year or two has stepped up its assistance significantly to Afghanistan, training its officers, providing military weapons, even sending some of its own people as advisors on the ground. And Afghanistan is the only place in the world where the Indians have security troops. The Indo-Tibetan border guards are there. So do you see the U.S. acquiescing to what seems to me to be a stepped-up Indian strategic presence in Afghanistan?
Power abhors a vacuum. And what is happening in Afghanistan is the creation of a power vacuum. We filled the space. Any place the U.S. goes, we filled the space. We're the 100-ton elephant in any room that we come into. By announcing that we're leaving, not with some residual force, but with total drawdown of forces in 2017, we've already started the power vacuum, and the various players in the region who now see that there's an opening here are moving, and India is the next elephant. And there's a happy marriage here between a new Indian government that is more robust, if you like, more eager to play a role, and new Afghan government, which has no doubts about Pakistan, and which now has doubts about America and the West, and is looking for a partner. In that sense, the ISI may well be creating the nightmare that they have always feared. If you live in a world of conspiracies, and you have conspiracy theories, don't be surprised if at some point in the future you convince the countries in your conspiracy that it's a great idea. And they decide, yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we partner and together and squeeze? In that sense, it's a little bit like the 1980s, certainly the early part of the 1980s, when I don't want to say Indira Gandhi and the Soviets were an alliance against Pakistan, but they certainly had a lot of mutual feelings about Pakistan. And Zia's nightmare, which I mentioned before, is not all that unrealistic. From Zia's perspective, Mrs. Gandhi had already dismembered the country once. Maybe she was going to do it again. That would have solved a lot of problems, theoretically. Of course, it wouldn't have solved anything, but theoretically. So I think India, the U.S. vote on this issue is a pretty weak vote. Why should anyone listen to America's thinking about what to happen in the future?
We have actually just about 5 minutes, so I'll ask people to ask their questions, and then you can decide which of them you'd like to answer. And starting in the back.
The easy ones.
Marvin.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. My name is John Lanzetta, a student here at SAIS. You mentioned you were looking at this one intelligent success in contrast to many failures. I was curious if there were any particular actions, innovations, decisions on the part of CIA leadership and guys on the ground that made this a success as opposed to just another failure.
You can hand the microphone right behind you. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Amin Ojan. I'm also a former student of Professor Riedel's. My question is, I think last week it was mentioned that Pakistan renewed its offers to train Afghan security forces. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, what you think their incentives are for that, and whether you think it would be wise for the Afghan government to take the offer, and also what implications that might have in the long run in terms of the necessity for a robust, several force Afghan security army. So.
And Marvin Weinbaum here. Yeah.
Marvin Weinbaum, Bruce.
There's a microphone coming.
Yeah. Bruce, accepting, as I think most of us do, the egg timer analogy here as it's just so obvious. But your comment here about the vacuum, well, we are stepping back. And you can make an argument which is very different than the one you just made by saying that it's only when the regional players themselves see enough incentive to, based on the fact that no government at this point is going to be better than a successful Kabul government with this new leadership. So that the U.S. policy, rather than trying to discourage any of this, and we're seeing this now with the Chinese being willing to be cooperative, the Iranians too have made the right signals, and the Russians made a statement last week. So I think, couldn't you make the case that it's in our interest, since we're not going to get a grand bargain with the Taliban, it's in our interest to see that these players step in rather than, as spoilers, step in as we step out?
Right. I'll give very quick answers to two questions and a longer answer to Marvin's. Pakistanis training Afghans is like putting the fox in the hen house. I can't see the Afghan army agreeing to something like that. Maybe some cosmetics, but not a serious program. And this is not a new offer either. This offer's been around for a long time. If there's a single aspect of success, I can't help but say this since this is a South Asia meeting, it's outsourcing. If you can find someone else to do the hard work, get them to do it. No boots on the ground, 50 people. Yeah. If someone else wants to do it, take all the risks, suffer the casualties. You may say it's hard-nosed, and I'd say, yeah, it is hard-nosed. Isn't that what you want your intelligence service to do when it conducts a covert operation? Keep its hand as covert as possible? You're absolutely right. The ideal outcome in Afghanistan is a regionally blessed outcome. I would argue that we will get that, we are more likely to get that if the region is more confident that there will be some residual American role. A precipitous move removes that level of confidence and has to raise in the minds of Mullah Omar, assuming Mullah Omar is alive, assuming that he has strategic thoughts. I mean, it's a remarkable war, you know. What kind of war do you have where the leader of the leader of your enemy for a dozen years is a person you've no idea whether they're alive or dead? And almost no effort to study the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, in the kind of way that we studied the Soviet Union or something like, or even study Al-Qaeda. It's remarkable. Why should he agree to anything short of ultimate victory if there's a shot that in 2017 Humpty Dumpty will collapse? Now, my modestly hopeful, and I'm not betting the Riedel mortgage payments on this, but my modest hope is that come mid-2017, the end of the fighting season in 2017, it will be clear Humpty Dumpty is not falling apart. Kandahar is not falling into the hands of the Afghan Taliban. They're not marching on Kabul. And then Mullah Omar may start to say to himself, or somebody else will start to say to Mullah Omar, perhaps with a pistol in their hand, maybe we ought to settle for less than 100%.
So reintegration, where it happens in an incremental way rather than a grand market.
Perhaps. There are all kinds of scenarios. But that scenario, to me, is highly unlikely to, any of those scenarios are highly unlikely to happen when the bitter enders and their supporters have a reason to believe that it's all going to fall into their lap in 2017. And that's why I would, let's leave a little more ambiguity in their minds about what we might do in 2017. Let's just for a minute, let's assume the worst. Let's assume that in the spring of 2017, like Mosul, Kandahar falls to the Afghan Taliban in a whirlwind, and they're marching on Kabul. And by the way, they're marching on Kabul, and you know who's marching with them? Ayman Zawahiri. Think of that nightmare. A prominent member of the Democratic Party with good connections to the White House ought to raise her voice on this issue now rather than wait until then.
Well, thank you so much. If you want to get a copy of the book, as I said, there's a flyer in the back at the left-hand side as we're facing toward the door. You can pick it up. It'll tell you how to get it. I think you'll find it a good read, and as you can see.
Thank you. It's fun.
This is good. Science is always kind of fun.
Oh, yeah, you get better questions.